So what is your design process?
Who's going to jump in first?
Well, I guess I can start. I feel like I've been doing this for only about 5 years, so I kind of feel like my whole process in general is a little bit amateur. But what I've been doing is I've been trying to use all of the different design approaches: digital, physical, and what I do is, like, one semester I kind of tend to focus more on drawing as opposed to models or even digital design. There was another semester where I focused more on digital design, and that was kind of earlier on. What happened was I let the design get a little bit too out of hand, actually, and then I had trouble finishing the project there at the end. So
Really?
yeah. So I feel like I've kind of dabbled in several different approaches, and I can't say that I have a very clearly defined, a very specifically defined process yet. So I'd be interested to hear kind of your guys' take on how you guys manage those different approaches.
Well, if we're not going in order, then I'll jump in. So maybe, as Thanos walks in, maybe the question is, how do we define digital design? How do we define physical design? What do we mean when we ask the question, right? So maybe we have to back up a little bit and ask the question. So I think we too often we use these words very loosely, right? So, repeat the question one more time. It was about workflow.
Right. The question is, what is the workflow of your designs from the conception to the finished artifact?
Okay, so we're really talking about workflow, but I'm going to make like a general statement on the whole conversation, because we have to define these terms a little bit more precisely. We use words like digital design, or computational design, or physical design, or parametricism. So Georgia Tech students, after an infamous lecture last year, thought that parametricism meant curvy objects, right? And I'm not joking. I had this conversation with multiple students. And so we have to be careful when we use throw these words around. What do we really mean? So for me, I was educated, especially in my undergraduate education, completely analog techniques. Everything was done by hand. Hand drafting, hand modeling, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, I didn't even like using computers in my undergraduate. In between undergraduate and graduate, I worked professionally for a variety of offices, learned more about the sort of tools that were out there, and became more adept at them. And in graduate school, got really sort of into what we might call digital design, computational design. Having said that, for me, the workflow is project dependent. That's the first thing. It's project dependent. So it depends on what questions I'm trying to ask. Okay? But let's just take a typical example. For me, it would be about starting with an idea and trying to understand an idea through a series of experiments. Those are typically going to be physical experiments using material. So I'm very much materially oriented, because what I'm interested in ultimately is the material world, right? The world that we understand. While we also have to understand the abstract world, the lineaments and the material, right, in the Albertian sense. So I would typically start with the idea of a material experiment, and I would try to draw out, let's say, either analytical or generative diagrams out of that material experiment. And then I would ask the question, how do I think about the constraints or the possibilities of that experiment relative to the potential of a computational environment, right? So how do I parameterize this effect, or how do I parameterize that phenomena, or how do I parameterize that connection, right, or whatever it might be? How do I understand it in terms of its constraints and its possibilities? And then I would probably start testing that, right? I would start looking at different permutations relative to lots of other things that we're sort of leaving out of this conversation, site, program, et cetera, et cetera. And then I would start testing that back against the physical construct that I was ultimately trying to produce, right? So again, maybe that's just the sort of extension of what you're talking about, is this constant interplay between the material world and the abstract world, be it a computational system or a digital representation, which are actually two different things, right? You can have computational design without having computers, right? We know that. So I think I'll stop there.
Kind of take, is this one? I could take it in another, I guess, a different direction. And for us in our firm, we do a lot of campus work, and it starts with kind of big big scale master planning. So for us, the decision on how the tools we use determine at what scale you're working at. And the good thing about a computer is that you can get into great detail. The bad thing about a computer is it forces you to kind of address details sometimes when you're not ready. So what, at least I kind of have a feet in both worlds. Don't like your background. Yeah, I also, when I went to school, the computer, AutoCAD was recently invented, and it was kind of a threatening thing. It was very controversial, and if you did something on it, it was, you were, almost shunned. So you have this tension between academia and the work world in regards to the tools. I think things are very different now from what I'm seeing, and it's very exciting. But for us, our firm kind of embraced the BIM technology very early, and so it has helped us to develop the massing in a very sophisticated way very early. But at the same time, I like to use that tool to generate underlays and then hand sketching using the tools kind of together so that before you have had the time to develop enough of the feeling in a computer.
And less is more, too. It's about
right.
how much information you need.
And once again, it goes back to the scale. If I'm trying to make big decisions, I need to be working in a small scale. And hand drawing allows me to filter out the amount of decisions I have to make at any given time. It lets me get to the next step without getting bogged down.
And I think that brings up a point I forgot to mention too. I've tried starting digital early on, and every time I've tried, it doesn't go anywhere. I find that in the early stages of my design process, I have to do things by hand because it's so quick and it's so easy to kind of just draw over those details you don't know yet and come back to them later. But it's hard to do digitally, and I found that has helped really with my progress in my designs.
I mean, I'm kind of somewhere in between, I think. I'm attached at the hip to a Moleskine notebook. I don't ever put down my hand drawings whatsoever. And I'm kind of like you. I start by laying out the issues at hand and then trying to decide what the end goal is going to be and then decide what path I'm going to take, critical path to get to an end goal. And if the critical path is a rendering and that's it, I'm not going to jump into Revit from day one. I'm not going to jump into Rhino. I might jump into something like Revit massing and then Photoshop really quick, just something to get something across really fast. But I always, always, always sketch everything out analog first, every single time. And then I'll iterate in the computer after I've sketched it out and thought it through, make something finished in the computer, and then I'll go back when I hit an issue and sketch it out more so that there's constantly a back and forth between my notebook and my models and the computer, my digital work. One thing that's interesting that I've noticed with my work is that my sketchbook shows a timeline of design progression, whereas the computer only shows a snapshot of one instance along that timeline. So one detailed instance shows up in the computer, but that's it. My sketchbook tells the story that got it to that point. And I'm still figuring mine out too, big time. But that's what's comfortable right now to me is to jostle back and forth. And if it's not comfortable and not fluent in the computer, I jump out of the computer and immediately throw it down on paper.
So it's interesting. I think we're starting to get into the format here a little bit. And I think part of the reason to have these conversations is to see all the different sort of methodologies. For me, I think that the computer is an amazing series of snapshots because I make an instance, copy, make another instance, copy, make another instance, copy. And it's the idea of iterating. And it's not necessarily linear, right?
Right.
Because those iterations might be in a circle or they might be in a figure eight, right? Conception, not literally.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you say that because I find the computer to be...
Is what it's called.
Excuse me?
The infinite design route.
The infinite design route, and you get stuck in it and then you go crazy.